Hello and welcome to Media Monitor, where we analyse the news media both here at home and abroad. And we're coming to you live from our Auckland Park studios here in Johannesburg on the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. I'm Peter Ndora. Very good morning to you. Thanks for tuning in. Here's what you can look forward to on the show today. We'll be exploring the ongoing Zimbabwe internet shutdown that a UN declaration sees actually as a human rights violation. We'll also be unpacking whether or not the New York Times crossed the line when it published images of dead people in the Kenya terror attack this past week. But before we engage with our panel on all of these stories, let's first take a look at the Sunday newspaper headlines. And we start with the Sunday Times. This newspaper is leading with a story about how former President Jacob Zuma allegedly pocketed 300,000 rand a month to protect Bosasa chiefs from prosecution for paying millions of rands in bribes to secure lucrative government contracts. The publication further states that the details of the payments are set to come before the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into State Capture tomorrow morning in evidence to be presented by former Bosasa COO Angelo Agrizi. Well, the City Press is also carrying the same story, all about how Agrizi is set to drop more bombshells at the state capture inquiry this week, with names of high-profile politicians and the bribes that he claims they received. The Sunday Independent is also running with the same story about how the Zondo Commission of Inquiry unfolded this past week, with Agrizi on the stand and shocked the nation, I suspect. Now, the Sunday Tribune, the KZN's Sunday Tribune, is leading with a story about how former Springbok and Sharks fly half Pat Lambie has been forced to hang up his boots because of health concerns. And Cape Town's Weekend Argus is carrying a story about how death threats and intimidation have hounded the volunteer firefighter who risked his life trying to extinguish the Betty's Bay New Year's Eve fire and then helped police to bring the suspected arsonist to book. Crossing our border, Eswatini's Sunday Observer has reported on how Eswatini's electricity company employees are downing tools because of a delay in alignment with their salaries. According to the publication, management at the company received their increments through circulars as well as a cost of living adjustment. And in West Africa, Nigeria's Daily Trust is running a story on how the Nigerian military has assembled thousands of troops and equipment in preparation for a massive operation to retake Baga and other 5 towns in the northern part of Borno State from the militant group Boko Haram. We begin, though, with some sad news. Award-winning author, journalist and anti-apartheid activist Hugh Lewin died on Wednesday this past week at the age of 79. At just 24, Lewin was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his activities in the African Resistance Movement, a small group of activists that executed acts of protest sabotage, as he put it, against the apartheid state. He then spent 2 decades in exile in the UK as well as in Zimbabwe. Returning to South Africa in the early 90s, he continued the rest of his life in service of his country, particularly in the advancement of journalism. President Ramaphosa this week paid tribute to him, saying that we've lost an incredible writer and a valiant soldier who fought fearlessly for human rights and justice and the freedom that are the hallmarks of democracy. I'm now joined on the line by veteran journalist Ntate Joe Tlolwe to share his thoughts with us about this fallen stalwart. Joe, thanks very much for joining us. Welcome to the program. You knew Hugh when he was still a young man. Take us back to that time.
Hugh used to work for the Paris Post and Drum. And I was a reporter at the time. And on Saturdays, we had very easy days because we would be waiting for copy from sports journalists. And while we were waiting for the copy, we would sit around having a few things and would argue about all sorts of things. But the most amusing one at the time was the fact that they used to tease me for having joined the Pan-Africanist Congress. And I would say to you and other subs who were sitting around with us, I'd say to them, show me one white person who will raise his gun against his kids and kin in support of black liberation. And we would have those almost every Saturday. And unbeknown to me, I didn't know that he was a member of the African resistance movement, a group of young white people, members of the Liberal Party, who had started to work against the government at the time. And it only emerged after he was arrested that as I was arguing with him, he was in fact a member of the African resistance movement, and that he was part of the plot by John Harris to go and bomb the Johannesburg station, the white part of the station. So he kept quiet through those arguments, not saying a word about his involvement. And I only got to know about it much, much later. And then I got to work with him again when he's returned from exile. I was on the board of the Institute for the Advancement of and you.
Oh dear, it looks
and
like...
Hugh came to join us at the Institute as executive director. So he was still committed to journalism right up to the end.
All right, you knew him at different periods in his life, and 20 years in between, he was still very much interested in South Africa's future. What was the man like when he came back from 2 decades of exile? Compare the two Hughs that you knew.
Hugh was still committed to our liberation. He was still writing and doing the things that he had been doing before he went to exile. So he was still committed to liberating our country. But this time using his pen to continue the struggle for liberation.
All right. So I wonder, as someone who knew his work and knew him for many years, what was it about him that he was able to write award-winning books?
Hugh had a love of words and a love of writing. That's why one of the reasons why he was recruited by Selwyn Smith to come in and work as a sub-editor at Post. It's that love of words and writing that made him stand out.
All right, and perhaps finally, what are you going to remember most about Hugh?
He was a very gentleman. By the way, he had a broadcaster's voice. But he was a very gentleman, very well modulated, if you might say that.
All right. Bra Jotlolwe, thanks very much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us today on this stalwart, Hugh Lewin, who passed away this past week. Thanks so much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, okay, so in fact I'm actually going to push this a little bit further now. My guests this morning are Director at Media Monitoring Africa, William Bird, and Shamano Mahadi, who is a broadcast specialist lecturer at the Tshwane University of Technology. Thanks very much for joining us, both of you. William, you were friends with Hugh, you knew him, you spent time with him as well. What are your thoughts about Hugh Lewin?
So one of the things that... And speaking to people about it over the last week, is the word that continually comes up is around him being gentle. You know, he had, so again, there's a group of people, and Tate Joe, you know, people that have been through the worst that our apartheid government had to offer in many respects. And instead of coming out bitter and angry, they've come out and they've got this humanity and this gentleness about them that is just incredible. And yet it masks this incredible strength and steel. You know, it's like they're the ultimate terminators, you know, which is to say they have this mission. It was continue building democracy, and it'll come, and they'll just keep moving and moving and moving, and you can do what you like. They're just going to keep on going, you know. And I think that Hugh was very much one of those people. And he also had this incredibly lovely sense of humor about things, you know. He would and I think just the fact that he was willing to give time and advice to anyone, you know, young people like me. When I first met him, you know, he was amazing. My
final question for you before I move to Kenya. I met Hugh Lewin a few times in Zimbabwe, actually, and at that stage I was a young auditor, and I met him in a work capacity. He's running Baobab Books and I think a sister company called Academic Books. And the thing was, I didn't realize the bigger story about Hugh Lewin. And I wonder if even now there's a generation of people who really don't understand and know his immense contribution to the South Africa we're enjoying now.
Well, I suspect that that's the case around a lot of our own heroes. You know, our immediate past is so fascinating and riveting, actually, and I think we need to really make sure that we do everything we can to remember and recall those heroes and honor them when they're still here. And Tate Joe, you were just talking to him. He's another living legend, that man as well. And I'm not sure how many people know his story. And there's so many others that are like him. And as much as it's a cruel and bitter history that we need to go through, I think we need to, you know, we've got more hero stories than there are in the entire Marvel hero universe, and we need to be pulling them out and hearing them because they're inspirational.
Oh, thanks very much indeed for your thoughts. We'll continue conversation with you and Shamana shortly, but first I want to go to Kenya because the decision made by the New York Times to use the photographs of dead bodies slumped over a restaurant table during the Nairobi terror attack this week was instantly condemned on Kenyan social media. The New York Times has come under immense criticism for this and is said to have handled attacks in the US and Europe in a different way. The newspaper was accused of using the misery and tragedy of Tuesday's terror attack at the Dusit Hotel for clickbait. Well, to help us unpack the story a little further and the ethics of the journalism, I'm now joined via Skype from Kenya by humanitarian advocate, political commentator and writer Nanjala Nyabola. Thanks very much for joining us. I suppose still by today people are still angry because this picture is still on the New York website, I believe.
Yeah, it's really interesting, I think, for us because the New York Times has doubled down and even trebled down on the fact that they were perfectly justified in using these images and they were perfectly justified in publishing them the way they did. And their line is that this was standard editorial practice, standard editorial approach, and they have come out quite defensively, I would say, against Kenyans who have pushed back against this and saying, well, actually, you had terrorist attacks in Colombia and in Kabul in the same week, and you didn't have a similar kind of coverage. You didn't have pictures of dead people in the immediate aftermath of an attack, you know, before families had even been notified. You didn't have those images in your papers. What is it about Black death and Black suffering that makes you think that you can present this information in this way, and you wouldn't do it another way? So, yeah, the images are still up and the conversation is still going. I think a lot of people feel very strongly, and rightfully so, that there's an element of double standards here. There's an element of, are you actually reflecting on what it is that you're doing, or is this just the MO, the modus operandi, when it comes to covering Black death and comes to covering African suffering?
I mean, they've defended themselves, saying that this notion that they're treating Black lives differently is not true. They said, and they showed pictures, I think Las Vegas shooting, Oklahoma City bombing, where they showed pretty graphic pictures. Is that a defense?
To me personally, it's not a defense. I think that in general, the use of suffering and the use of that kind of gory imagery is counterproductive in the long run when it comes to journalism. And a lot of people say, and this is the line that the New York Times has taken, that it shows the full extent of what suffering looks like. But if you have to traumatize your audience repeatedly in order to communicate a message, then that just says that you're not doing a good enough job of communicating your message otherwise. You're not writing clearly enough. You're not investing in understanding or presenting stories in a accurate and deep way, in the way the stories need to be reported. I don't think you need to traumatize audiences in order to get your message across. And this is a line that I think I've taken with similar imagery coming out of the Mediterranean Sea, when you had journalists taking pictures of dead bodies washing up on the shores of Greece and Turkey. And fine, there was an immediate sense of let's do something about it. But what has happened in the long run? People have become desensitized to these images. They no longer associate them with real suffering, with real people. And then the other piece of the puzzle, I think, was the attack was ongoing, and there were still many people who did not know where their loved ones were. There were still many people who didn't know where their friends and family were. And there was also the question of, should you be finding out that your family member has died by clicking on a link or going to a newspaper website? Is that the right and respectful way of handling this situation?
So where does one draw the line? Is there a standard that can be applied that all media houses should follow? Because there are some people who say, I don't want censored news. I don't want you deciding for me what I can and cannot see. I want to make that choice myself.
That's a fantastic question. And I think it's something that we're just going to have to keep passing through. I think it's just going to have to be some kind of, because that's what standards are, right? It's a community, the media consuming, media producing community coming together, pushing and pulling and deciding what kind of stories we want to be told. And there, at this particular point in time, there isn't an easy answer. What is clear is that there is an implicit double standard in the stories that are told, in whose bodies get packaged in a certain way. And you have to keep in mind that this New York Times situation is happening in a broader context. It's happening in the broader context of Western media houses only covering stories in Africa that have to do with suffering, that have to do with death, that have to do with terrorism, that have to do with disease. And so it's really part of a constellation of data points. It's not just this one story. It's an accumulation of stories that have left people feeling like, why are you only looking at us when we are dying and when we are in these moments of indignity? And so what would be the productive way forward for me as we're trying to find these standards is for us to have an actual honest, open, and inclusive conversation, and not necessarily what we've seen in the last week, which has been a lot of hostility, a lot of dismissiveness, a lot of condescension, a lot of abuse. And not necessarily saying, this is unacceptable because of X, Y, Z, and now we need to find a better way moving forward.
Are you surprised at just how much they've dug in their heels and the lengths that they've gone to try and defend this? It would have been much easier just to say sorry and move on. But for some reason, it's almost as if, the whole organization will collapse if they take these pictures down.
Me personally, I'm not surprised. In part, it has to do with, and you were mentioning you had a previous hat as an auditor. I have a previous hat as a lawyer. And in part, it has to do with liability. And, accepting liability in a certain context exposes you to litigation, exposes you to punishment in other contexts. So I would bet good money that at some point their lawyer said, say whatever you need to do without accepting liability, because once you accept liability, then we're walking into murky territory. On the other hand, I do think that there's an element of people are accustomed to approaching journalism about Africa in a certain way. And I don't think that they were ready for the kind of organized, systematic backlash that we've seen coming out of Kenya. And I've written extensively about this, about how, because of what online spaces represent in Kenya, there's a heightened level of awareness and a heightened level of connection and a heightened level of organization. And so things like this, it's not a tree falling in the night. People are paying attention, people are watching, and people are listening. So I don't think they were ready really for there to be a pushback from, an African country, because African countries are not their primary audiences. They don't produce this news for Nanjala in Nairobi or for Peter in Johannesburg. This news is produced for someone, in New York, in Minnesota, in London, or whatever. And so there was no expectation that there would be this level of awareness and this level of organization. And I'm not really surprised, because I think that people are just accustomed to this extractive model of foreign correspondent sort of reporting, that there isn't an expectation of agency in the people whose stories are being told. And this is one of the questions that we're going to have to keep thinking about as we move forward. What do we want journalism about Africa to look like moving forward? That's really, for me, the big question that's on the table right now.
All right. Nanjala, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so, so much. Asante sana, kwaheri.
Thank you. Have a good day.
All right, so that was Nanjala Nyabola with some very insightful thoughts about the situation in Kenya and media. We're going to explore that a little bit further with my guests in studio, and also remind them we've had these challenges as well with our own images in the past. All of that still to come. Stay with us.
We at Network explore all things technological.
The modern battlefield is the battlefield of the mind, and the tools for affecting the mind are social media.
We look at how technology advances medicine and education.
Children can learn up to 60% more information in a shorter condensed amount of time using virtual reality as a medium for instruction.
From music, gaming, even computer-generated supermodels. Be a part of our network Saturdays at 8:30 p.m. and Sundays at 5:30 p.m.
Working for SABC News, I can comfortably say that it has afforded me the opportunity to have a balanced view of society, covering live events from all over the country. I've seen the hunger that people actually have for independent and impartial news. I'm Nompumelelo Mthethwa, and I am SABC News.
Right, welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. Just before the break, we were in Kenya talking about an image that the New York Post posted about showing dead bodies slumped over a restaurant table and the outrage that's caused in Kenya. We come back now to South Africa, and I'm joined by my panelists. And I want to ask you both, did the New York Post, in your view, cross the line?
I think they did. I believe you don't have to traumatize your audience to get the message across. But I also get the sense that there's an element of we care less from the New York Times. I mean, the people of Kenya, they've expressed their dismay, and some of these pictures are still there. So I believe the story could still have been reported without showing those pictures in the manner in which the New York Times did. Yeah.
All right. So William, we've gone through the same challenges. I remember the image of Emmanuel Sithole being stabbed in Alexandra, was shot, and people were angry that this picture was taken. But in some ways, that picture was a powerful image in showing exactly what was going on and bringing consciousness to the story. We've seen images of people being necklaced in the height of xenophobic attacks. Have we crossed the line at times, do you think?
Oh, there's no doubt, but I think it speaks to the question you raised earlier, which is what's the rule? So if you look at journalist ethics, there's some kind of linked but often competing issues, which is report the truth as fully as possible and then minimize harm. So you've got those two things which in this instance are going to compete, which is to say that there are instances where you can and should justify using extraordinarily brutal images One of the more famous ones, the image of Hector Peterson, of course. You know, ordinarily you'd say you should never show an image of a child dying. But of course, at the time, in 1976, when the world wasn't aware of what was actually going on, or the extent, even though Sharpeville had happened before that, the extent, and that they were willingly opening fire on unarmed school children, there's an argument that can be made about the necessity and importance of why you show that. Now, if you then take that back and you say, well, let's look at the patterns around how you do choose to show these things and what systems you put in place to mitigate the potential harm that does come from them. In the newsroom, they need to have that debate and say, is it essential for this story? Does it advance the news and news value of the story for us to tell it, as opposed to just horrifying?
So why did they get it wrong in Kenya then, if we're applying the 1976 scenario?
Yeah. So William talks about the importance and the necessity. So I would say, yes, you have to judge this and look for the most important message. In the case of Kenya, could they have not tell the story in the same way that it will still have the same level of impact without those pictures? You're very right in citing the example of Hector Peterson, 1976. The world needed to know of the atrocities, how brutal it was, you know, back then. But in the case of New York Times, I would argue differently to say you could still have told the story without using those images in the manner in which New York Times did.
All right, okay, we're going to leave Kenya because right next door, a situation's been developing this past week. Zimbabwe's government again forced a total internet shutdown on Friday. A media group says that after a days-long violent crackdown on people protesting dramatic fuel price increases, reports broke out on Tuesday that Zimbabwe's government had moved to block citizens' access to social media and in some instances access to the internet altogether. On Wednesday night, Econet Wireless Zimbabwe, which is a network provider there, the country's biggest mobile phone operator, said that it was still blocking access to some social media sites, such as WhatsApp, on government instructions. According to reports, the state ordered the services disconnected to quell the protests that led to clashes with police, in which it's being reported as many as 8 people could have died. Authorities, however, are saying that only 3 people died, including 1 policeman.
Days of violent protests in Zimbabwe, and then on Friday another internet blackout. It was part of the government's response to stop the unrest, which also includes a security crackdown. Reuters' McDonald Zerutwe is in the capital, Harare.
We woke up this morning to find out that there was an internet blackout, and one of the, in fact, the main mobile phone operator, which also owns the biggest internet company, did send messages to clients saying that it had received a directive from the government to completely shut down the internet until further notice. So what that basically means is that people have no access to internet, no access to any internet applications, so including social media sites. Many people are not able to work.
Internet was also temporarily cut earlier in the week. Friday's blackout was partially lifted later in the day, but some social media sites were still blocked. Meanwhile, the United Nations is calling for an end to the use of force. The government says several have died in the demonstrations that broke out after President Emmerson Mnangagwa raised fuel prices by 150%. Activists say the toll is much higher. Protesters accuse Mnangagwa of failing to live up to his campaign pledge to kickstart their economy and of crushing dissent like his predecessor, Robert Mugabe.
That's the fear of many people, that this will become a routine exercise whenever the government is confronted by protest. For Zimbabweans, Zimbabwe has basically fallen into familiar ways, right? Many people had given Mnangagwa the benefit of the doubt that, although he was a right-hand man for Mugabe for all those years since independence in 1980, he could steer the country in a totally different direction.
People are queuing for hours to get gasoline, and food prices have shot up. The government has allowed some allowances to public workers to offset the cost.
All right, let's delve into this, gentlemen. The United Nations declares internet shutdowns a violation of freedom of speech and is a violation of human rights. Your thoughts on this week in Zimbabwe?
Well, I think what is happening in Zimbabwe, without question, Peter, you can see a clear motive to try and shut, people's voices. That's what it is. And I look at it and I can almost see the situation here in South Africa. If you'd remember a Fist Must Fall campaign, it was such a powerful and a very successful campaign, and the Zimbabwean authority know for a fact that people are going to mobilize themselves, they're going to unite themselves, and across the streets of Zimbabwe, they are going to be communicating via all forms of, platforms, whether it's Facebook or it's WhatsApp. So this is very clear. There's an intention to try and shut people, let them not speak at all. I think that is basically the motive here.
So it can be dangerous, the internet and social media. It can incite violence. It can cause chaos and mayhem. Is there ever a point that, and we heard yesterday on the SABC News channel, independent MP Themba Mliswa was saying that, yes, people were looting and causing chaos. We must shut the internet down. Is there a case to do that?
The short answer in this instance is no, because you've got a government that is only too willing to shut down the access, not just in one area or in a specific instance, to prevent specific violence, for example. Remember that when we talk about limiting rights, they've got to be proportional to the relative threat and the potential harm that may be caused in there. And they've got to be justifiable under some kind of national or order or basis for taking such extreme action. And in this instance, it's clear that this is about silencing dissent, and that this is about preventing people from being able to share and communicate thoughts, ideas and opinions. And that is fundamentally, profoundly unacceptable. I think we have to be saying, why is the response from our own government so deeply and profoundly limited and pathetic? Why is the response from the mobile operators, our multinationals, our own South African interests that are operating there, where are their statements from those companies saying, we have to do this because we're abiding by direct instruction. If we don't, they'll shut our business down. But I think that the level of condemnation from this, and the fact that the president of Zimbabwe is apparently, missing in action or having a lot of very expensive coffee and tea in one of the most expensive places in the world. It's completely and fundamentally outrageous that at this point in time, when they're meant to be moving towards democracy, that they're taking such ridiculous draconian steps.
All right. You mentioned the legality of whether the service providers should be shutting down their internet usage to citizens. They said they're compelled by the law. So what I decided to do is to get a Harvard, Oxford-trained Zimbabwean lawyer to look at this law, and this is what he told me during the week.
So you would find that on the information which is circulating, including the Twitter post, which I just saw from the Ministry of Information from the government of Zimbabwe, the basis of them switching off the internet, they cite this law called the Interception of Communications Act in Zimbabwe. And they cite in particular Article 6. And to my worry, I've seen even telecom companies citing the same law, saying we are abiding by this law in order to do this switching of the internet. I would want to categorically state this. It's wrong. That law doesn't provide for that. As it says, interception of telecommunications. Interception is actually defined in that particular act. And this is how it is defined. It refers to the listening, to the recording and copying of conversations of citizens.
Okay.
In other words, it's an issue of
So they can spy on you, but they can't switch you off.
Yes, which is a human rights initiative, but it was not an issue. It is not an issue of switching off the internet.
So you're saying that the service providers could have refused in law to switch off the internet as they felt compelled to do so?
Particularly, they would have, there was grounds for them to refuse.
All right. Okay, that case is actually before the courts as we speak, and a decision will be made, but it does seem that the law is quite clear. And I suppose because we live in a digital age, by shutting down the internet, actually, and probably what they were really trying to do was to shut down the media, because that's what got the government into trouble August 1.
No, you can see, I mean, it's the same modus operandi. It's the same thing that when Mugabe was still in charge, will do. But what worries me most about this situation is that Emmerson Mnangagwa is not seem to be bothered. The way I am looking at it, I mean, he's been out of the country at the time when probably the country needs him the most. And if you look at it again, people are going to ask these questions. Is there a difference between what we have seen in the past and with this current regime? Yes, I mean, there were jubilations in 2017 when he ascended to power to say, at least maybe we're going to begin to see some kind of changes. Are we going to see changes with stuff like this? I doubt that very much.
But the thing that's difficult for the Zimbabwean government now is that you can't shut down information. VPN was being used by a number of Zimbabweans, and this ability to tell your computer that you're actually in another location when you're not in Zimbabwe. So the media still was able somehow to get images and the stories out. And it just begs the question then, you know, to a number of African governments this past year, continuing to deploy this tactic of shutting down the internet.
It is. It's completely offensive, and it's a clear violation of what is increasingly being understood as a basic human right, which is access to the internet. And I guess, you know, these people, the people that are doing this are people that are fundamentally and profoundly out of touch with reality. They think, ooh, we can do this, and unless they've got an absolute iron grip where they could shut down the entire network, they aren't going to be able to stop VPNs. People will find their way around this, as they do the world over. And what they need to start learning is that if you want to actually govern and retain loyalty, you've got to find governing in a different way. You know, this is not going to stop it. You can't. It's not like go and stop the printing press any longer. And so what you'll see is that in other areas where you've got darker forces that have worked this out, where these people, they go and they insidiously interject their own propaganda into things, and we've seen that happen in Brazil and in, you know, all sorts of other recent electoral processes. That's the kind of new form of censorship. This really is a profoundly outdated version and attempt to do it. And it doesn't make it any less brutal or nonsensical or offensive to or anti-democratic, but it certainly is one of the methods that's, you know, they if they want to be up to date, I mean, and spend time in Davos, then they need to actually learn about this thing called the Fourth Industrial Revolution.
The Chinese, for example, Peter, they've been doing this for quite some time. Probably the difference here is that you don't have the same kind of outrage as in what we have seen in Zimbabwe. On the one hand, the Chinese would argue to say, if the economy is stable, if we are able to create jobs and give you all that you need, why do you have to worry about
sharing ideas?
Sharing ideas, you know. So it's quite sad what we see in Zimbabwe, quite frankly, and I think it must, by all means, be condemned.
All right, okay. Well, it's going to be a big week, I'm sure, in the coming week as the president continues to stay away. And another shutdown has been called for this week as well. So if that's adhered to, well, one wonders what that might mean. We'll be back with more on Media Monitor after this. Stay with us.
SABC News team means
tell an independent and impartial African story.
I'm proud to be part of the SABC News team,
bringing business news to the man on the street and the executive in the boardroom.
We expose challenges faced by communities on a daily basis.
It is to take you behind the headlines, to show you the faces, and take you to the places that make this country beautiful.
And that's the power of the SABC, to go beyond the story.
I am SABC News.
I am SABC News.
I am SABC News.
And I am SABC News.
We are at the forefront of Africa's tech discussion.
We're already planning for the 5G spectrum to be licensed by 2020.
In Mauritius, for fiber migration, we had a strategy. On network, we have gadgets, robots, and more.
We focus on investing in entrepreneurs and technology in emerging markets.
There's technology and social media news on network with me, Pumelele Zondi, every Saturday at 8:30 p.m. and every Sunday at 5:30 p.m.
Welcome back. You're watching Media Monitor on the SABC News Channel. It's time now to take a look at what's on the front pages and inside the Sunday newspapers. Right, gentlemen, I suppose there really is one story this past week that has captured the imagination of people. And as this man, Angelo Agrizi, was speaking, we couldn't believe what he was saying and the scale of what was being said. Your thoughts on the front pages and what looks like is going to be another bombshell week? Chavana?
Look, Peter, I think it's going to be a week of Agrizi throughout. So, I mean, the interesting reports, as you were talking just during the, the ad break, everybody seemed to be leading with that story from Sunday Times to City Press with the headline, Agrizi has more bombs to drop. So, I think this is really unprecedented. I mean, there's one line that sort of caught my attention in this report where it suggests that the City Press was told by two of Agrizi's confidants that he has the entire hard drive that contains CCTV footage and videos and photographs. So you can just imagine, I mean, there are some of the names that have already been mentioned. If you look at what Sunday Times also is leading with, the president, former president, receiving 300,000 on a monthly basis. That's and I wonder how this week is going to look like. More revelation definitely is expected. Yeah.
William?
I mean, it's astonishing. One of the best tweets I think I saw in the week was from Natasha Josephs. She said her eyes are going to be stuck in an elevated position from being raised for the rest of her natural life, just given the sort of things that this man is saying. And it's astonishing. I mean, you could barely keep up with the fact that the secretary of the Zondo Commission was himself implicated as having taken money under the DOJ. So it's including the former Hladi Motsoneng. The question I have around these things is, where are these WMC people now? Because if ever you want to see a group of evil white men who've sought to take over a country, I mean, hello, this looks like it. I mean, Bosasa appears to have more fingers in more pies than all of the bakeries in all of the entire world. It's just astonishing.
So I have a question for you, and this is surprising. A lot of, I won't say a lot because I'm not sure, some of what we've heard has been reported on for quite some time. And I'm fascinated by the shock and amazement now. Is it that people haven't read newspapers, haven't been paying attention, or unless it's on TV and it's got a hashtag next to it, do we pay attention? I'm going to show you Adrian Besson. He was explaining to us this past week, actually, just how much of this information has been on the radar for some time.
You were looking at this, I think, 10 years ago at the Mail and Guardian. The editor then, Nick Dawes, is sort of lamenting the fact that this didn't gain traction, these claims against Bosasa, until now. Why?
Look, there's a lot of corruption in South Africa, unfortunately, that we write about on a weekly basis. I sometimes can't even remember what we published the week before. I think for me personally, Bosasa was just at the time when the arms deal was still in the news, Oilgate was in the news, there was a lot of corruption allegations. It was picked up at the time, of course. Lindam T left his job as head of prisons. Maybe the fact that it was the prisons department made the story less attractive. But I always knew there was more. It was clear to me that a number of ANC people were involved. If you just look at the history of Bosasa, the company was first owned by a trust owned by the ANC Women's League. So there were those ties from the beginning. I think as a country, we run the risk of becoming corruption fatigued and ignoring these allegations. Obviously, it would also have been nice if we had an active functioning criminal justice system over the past 10 years that, like in the cases of Shabir Sheikh and Jackie Selebe, which was now 10 years ago almost, actually prosecute corruption. We stopped seeing those cases going to court.
So that was, going back years. Do you think that the difference is social media?
No.
What is the difference?
I think that the difference fundamentally is that there was no action being taken, and if you look at it from any of those kind of scandals, the way the media work is that they report on something, they expose it, and then hopefully some kind of action or democratic institution kicks in and takes action. But we've seen repeatedly over the last 10 years that that's happened and it's happened and it's happened, but that any of the democratic institutions that should be acting have failed to act. I mean, the NPA are the ones who actually have a lot to answer for. So I think once we get over just how extensive the spider web is, we need to look and say, well, hang on a minute. These people were getting all this cash from somewhere. He said in his testimony it was coming from casinos. That sounds a lot like money laundering to me. Who are those casinos? Who are the people behind that? Because in addition to the actual handing out of bribes, there's a whole backup network around that. And if we're going to do something about it, then it means that those institutions have to act. So I think it's not so much the issue of the media were reporting it. It's the fact that no state action was being taken on any of these things. Now it's just being heightened again, and hopefully with enough emphasis, because we're approaching elections, they actually have to look like they're doing something.
I'm going to put it to you, Shamana, that I do think social media is quite significant here, and it talks to access to information. Not a lot of people could afford newspapers, and not a lot of people were reading newspapers, but the penetration of mobile phones is enormous in South Africa. I think it's one of the highest on the continent.
That's correct.
And I wonder if that isn't playing into more outrage as we hear about these things, because actually they're not watching it on DSTV, the majority of people. They're actually reading about it on social media.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, research do state, those facts as well, to say most people are on their mobile. So I think it does have a huge impact. So I think what we have seen here, Peter, maybe just to take this a little bit forward, I think from the side of ordinary folks, there's some kind of, I don't know, I don't want to call it ignorance or what, but if you look at the number of years that some of these stories have been reported, people should have been outraged,
so that's why
and they should have been talking about these things. Yeah, they should have been.
I can only imagine they didn't know, because how can you have no roads, no hospitals, no latrines?
That's the thing, because in the end it boils down to those facilities that matters the most. You mentioning roads.
William's not convinced.
I mean, so it does have an impact in the end, because it's the money that is supposed to be helping people. You're talking about a country with a youth being in their majority. People are talking about jobs. On the one side, there's money that people are just stealing,
I think what makes a difference is that it's not an isolated thing and it's this person stealing from this person. Because where I would agree with you is that if you are someone living in an informal settlement, hearing that someone has stolen 50 million or R1 billion even. It doesn't mean anything. How much money is that? None of us could possibly dream of that amount of money anyway to begin with, let alone someone or a whole group of people living there where your daily focus isn't what are we going to do about good governance and fighting corruption. No, your daily focus is on getting food and jobs and putting food on the table for your family, and whereas what I think we're starting to do a lot better is that what these things are demonstrating is that this web of corruption affected every single area, and that because of that, there was less money for schools, there's no money for building the roads, no money for fixing the things, no money for installing proper toilets. All of these things
we're better explaining what state capture means.
That ought to becoming more apparent for people to see that it's all of these things, and that's not just one isolated, it's this entire festering git bag of scumbuggery people that have just been sitting there stealing.
So in terms of storytelling, from what I'm hearing from William, is that we should be at least doing a little bit more and try to explain to our people the level of impact. Take an example of an incident which I experienced in one of the hospitals in the province, where somebody is involved in a car accident, they are admitted, they needed to be examined, probably for, stay in hospital for 3 weeks or so. But somebody was discharged over the fact that there was a shortage of food. So there's
these stories will not end. Gentlemen, I'm going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. So to Shamano Mahadi, William Bird, both of you, thanks so much for being great guests, and your insights invaluable as always. To you at home, Baya Danki. Thank you. Totsiens. See you next week at the same time. And that's it for Media Monitor. More of the same next week. Have a great week, everybody.